My name is Marcus, and what I'm about to tell you happened 3 months ago during what should have been a routine underwater welding job on an offshore oil platform. I've been a commercial deep-sea welder for 8 years, working on everything, from bridge foundations to pipeline repairs in the Gulf of Mexico. It's dangerous work, the kind where one mistake can kill you instantly, whether from decompression, equipment failure, or drowning 200 feet below the surface. But I've never encountered anything like what I experienced on Platform Delta 7. Let me back up and explain how I got into this line of work. Most people don't even know commercial deep-sea welding exists. We're the ones who go down to fix the underwater infrastructure that keeps the oil industry running. Every offshore platform, every underwater pipeline, every submerged structure needs maintenance and repairs. And when something breaks 200 feet below the surface, you can't just send down a regular maintenance crew. You need someone trained in both commercial diving and underwater welding techniques. The training is brutal, 6 months of intensive certification, covering everything from decompression tables to underwater metallurgy. You learn to weld in conditions that would terrify most surface welders. Imagine trying to create perfect joints while suspended in dark water, wearing a bulky diving suit with limited visibility and the constant pressure of the ocean trying to crush you. The failure rate for the certification program is about 70%. Most people wash out during the deep water training phase, but the pay makes it worthwhile. Experienced deep-sea welders can make 6 figures easily, sometimes more if you're willing to work the really dangerous jobs. Platform repairs, pipeline maintenance, emergency fixes during storm season. The more remote and hazardous the location, the better the compensation. I've worked in the North Sea, the Gulf of Mexico, and even some classified military contracts that I can't discuss in detail. The job that changed everything came through my usual contractor, Deepwater Industrial Services. I'd worked with them for 3 years, always professional operations with proper safety protocols. Their project manager, Sandra Mills, called me on a Friday afternoon with what sounded like a straightforward emergency repair contract. Hurricane Melissa had torn through the Gulf 2 weeks prior, and one of their platforms was showing critical structural damage. The storm had been a monster, Category 4 winds and 30-foot swells that had damaged dozens of installations across the Gulf. Most platforms had weathered it reasonably well, but Platform Delta 7 had taken a direct hit. The hurricane's storm surge had pushed the entire structure 15 degrees off vertical before the emergency anchor systems could compensate. Several critical support welds had failed completely, and the platform was showing stress fractures that could lead to catastrophic collapse if not addressed immediately. Sandra explained that they needed emergency repairs on the platform's main support struts 180 feet below the surface. The damaged welds were load-bearing joints that held the entire platform structure together. If they failed completely, the platform would collapse into the Gulf, potentially killing the 12-man crew and causing an environmental disaster. The Coast Guard had given them 72 hours to either complete repairs or evacuate permanently. The pay was exceptional, $800 per hour for hazard work, with a minimum guarantee of 40 hours and a completion bonus of $15,000. That kind of money meant I could take the rest of the year off if I wanted. But more importantly, this was exactly the kind of challenging technical work that had drawn me to deep-sea welding in the first place. Complex repairs under extreme conditions where precision and expertise could mean the difference between success and disaster. I accepted the contract and spent the weekend gathering my equipment and reviewing the technical specifications. The platform schematics showed a complex network of steel support beams and cross braces designed to handle extreme weather conditions. The damaged areas were concentrated around the northeast support cluster, where the hurricane's rotational forces had created maximum stress. It would require days of meticulous underwater welding to restore full structural integrity. We arrived at platform Delta 7 on a Tuesday morning via helicopter transfer from Port Fourchon. The flight out took about 40 minutes, passing over dozens of other offshore installations dotting the Gulf waters. From the air, Delta 7 looked relatively normal, a standard four-leg platform with the usual complement of drilling equipment and crew quarters. But as we descended for landing, I could see subtle signs of the hurricane damage. Several antenna arrays were twisted or missing, and there were obvious repairs to the upper deck structures. The platform itself was one of the older installations, built in the early 1980s when offshore drilling was experiencing a major expansion in the Gulf. It showed its age in the worn paint, rust stains, and mechanical equipment that looked like it belonged in a museum rather than an active drilling operation. The helicopter landing pad had been recently repaired, with fresh welding marks visible around the support brackets. The crew of 12 seemed unusually quiet during the mandatory safety briefing. Most offshore crews are pretty talkative, especially when new contractors arrive. These guys barely made eye contact, focusing intently on their paperwork and equipment checks. When I tried to make conversation during the tour, I got short professional responses that didn't invite further discussion. Something about their behavior set off warning bells in my head, but I chalked it up to post-hurricane stress. The platform supervisor was a weathered man named Bill Harrison, probably in his late 50s, with the kind of sun-damaged skin that comes from decades of offshore work. He'd been working Gulf platforms since the 1970s and had the calm competence that comes from experience with dangerous situations. Bill walked me through the damage assessment reports while we stood on the main deck, oil-stained waves stretching endlessly in every direction. The welds failed along the northeast support cluster, Bill explained, pointing toward the massive steel legs disappearing into the dark water below. Hurricane caught us right at shift change, so we had skeleton crew. Topside when the worst hit. The platform tilted about 15 degrees off vertical before the emergency anchors could engage. We're lucky the whole thing didn't just collapse and take everyone with it. He handed me a waterproof tablet loaded with underwater photos of the damage. The images were sobering. The main support beam had multiple fractures running vertically for 8 to 10 feet, with several smaller stress cracks radiating outward like spider webs. The adjacent joints showed partial separations and metal fatigue that suggested the entire support system was on the verge of catastrophic failure. This wasn't just routine maintenance work. This was emergency structural repair that would require every bit of my training and experience. The welding specifications called for full penetration repairs using specialized underwater electrodes designed for high-stress applications. Each weld would need to be X-rayed and pressure tested to ensure structural integrity. The work would take place at 180 feet depth, well within my certification limits, but deep enough to require careful attention to decompression protocols. A single mistake in the welding technique could result in a joint failure that might not become apparent until the platform faced its next severe weather test. Any unusual conditions I should know about, I asked while reviewing the dive parameters and work schedules. The platform's maintenance logs showed routine operations with no significant incidents over the past 5 years. But Bill hesitated before answering, exchanging a look with his assistant supervisor that suggested there might be more to the story than what appeared in the official records. "We've had some equipment malfunctions recently," Bill finally admitted. "Sonar readings that don't make sense, communication glitches during dive operations. The electronics took a beating during the hurricane, so it's probably just storm damage to our instruments. But I thought you should know before you start working down there." I spent the rest of the day familiarizing myself with the platform's dive systems and conducting thorough equipment checks. They had invested in state-of-the-art diving equipment, including a modern diving bell system with surface-supplied air, heated suits, and redundant communication systems. The dive control room was impressive, with multiple monitors showing depth, air pressure, water temperature, and real-time video feeds from helmet cameras. My underwater welding rig was a portable arc welder specifically designed for subsea applications. The unit could produce clean, strong welds even in saltwater conditions, using specialized electrodes that displaced water and created a protective gas bubble around the weld zone. I'd used similar equipment on dozens of previous jobs, but I still spent several hours testing every component and backup system. When you're 180 feet underwater with tons of steel depending on your work, equipment reliability isn't just important, it's literally a matter of life and death. The platform's dive team consisted of a supervisor, a backup diver, and 2 surface support technicians. They were all experienced professionals with years of offshore diving experience. The dive supervisor, a guy named Tom Rodriguez, had been working Gulf platforms for over a decade. He walked me through their standard safety protocols, emergency procedures, and communication systems with the kind of thoroughness that suggested they took dive safety very seriously. That evening, I joined the platform crew for dinner in their compact mess hall. The meal was standard offshore fare, hearty food designed to fuel hard physical labor in challenging conditions. But the conversation was subdued, focused mainly on weather reports and routine maintenance schedules. I tried to engage the crew members in the usual shop talk about other platforms, mutual acquaintances in the industry, and recent projects, but their responses were polite but minimal. Several crew members kept glancing toward the windows facing the dive site, as if expecting to see something unusual in the dark water below. When I asked about it directly, they claimed it was just normal caution around diving operations. But there was something in their body language that suggested a deeper unease. These were experienced offshore workers who had seen everything the Gulf could throw at them, yet they seemed genuinely nervous about something. After dinner, I spent time reviewing the platform's maintenance records and incident reports. Most of the documentation was routine, the kind of detailed logs required by maritime safety regulations. But buried in the files, I found a few anomalous entries that caught my attention. Equipment malfunctions during routine inspections, unexplained. Sonar contacts, and at least 2 instances where dive operations had been aborted due to equipment failures that couldn't be reproduced during subsequent testing. One report from 6 months ago described a routine hull inspection that had been terminated when the diver reported seeing large objects moving just beyond the range of his lights. The official explanation was marine life. Probably a school of large fish or possibly a whale passing through the area. But the diver's description mentioned objects that maintained consistent distance and seemed to be following the platform's underwater structure in a deliberate pattern. Another incident report described communication problems during a pipeline inspection 3 months prior. The diver had lost contact with the surface for nearly 20 minutes before communications suddenly resumed without any technical explanation. During the blackout period, the surface crew had detected unusual acoustic signatures on their sonar equipment, sounds that didn't match any known marine life or mechanical systems in the area. The first dive was scheduled for 6 a.m. the following morning, giving me time to get a full night's rest before beginning the complex repair work. I tried to sleep, but found myself thinking about those incident reports and the crew's obvious nervousness. In my 8 years of deep-sea welding, I'd learned to trust my instincts about job sites. Most accidents happened when people ignored warning signs or dismissed their gut feelings about potentially dangerous situations. I woke up before dawn and spent an hour reviewing the welding specifications and dive plans one more time. The repair work would begin with the most critical structural damage, the complete fracture in the main support beam. This would require careful preparation of the metal surfaces, precise electrode positioning, and multiple welding passes to achieve full penetration. Each weld would need to cool and be inspected before moving on to the next section. The platform's dive control room was already bustling with activity when I arrived for the pre-dive briefing. Tom Rodriguez ran through the standard safety checklist, while technicians monitored weather conditions and equipment status. The Gulf was relatively calm, with 2-foot swells and minimal surface current. Water temperature at depth was holding steady at 78 degrees, warm enough to make the heated suit comfortable, but not absolutely necessary. I suited up in the dive chamber, while topside crew conducted final checks on all systems. The heated dry suit felt familiar and reassuring, like putting on a second skin after years of deep water work. The suit's integrated heating system would maintain body temperature even in much colder water, and the built-in communication wires allowed hands-free contact with the surface team. The diving helmet was a modern unit with integrated LED lighting, heads-up display showing depth and vital signs, and redundant communication systems. The helmet's sonar array could detect objects up to 200 feet away, providing crucial situational awareness in murky water conditions. Everything checked out perfectly during the pre-dive tests, with all systems showing green status indicators. Tom Rodriguez established communication contact as I prepared for deployment. "Comms check, Marcus. How do you read?" 5 by 5, I replied, testing the helmet's various display systems. The heads-up display showed ambient water temperature, air pressure, suit heating status, and estimated bottom time based on current air consumption rates. Everything looked normal and ready for deployment. They lowered me into the Gulf waters using the platform's hydraulic crane system, a smooth process that I'd experienced hundreds of times before. The transition from air to water always created a moment of sensory disorientation as my body adjusted to the pressure changes and the different way sound travels underwater. At 20 feet, I paused to clear my ears and allow my suit's pressure equalization system to stabilize. The descent continued smoothly until I reached 50 feet, where the sunlight began to fade significantly. The helmet's LED array automatically adjusted to provide optimal illumination, creating a cone of bright white light that extended about 15 feet in all directions. But something was different about the water conditions today. Normally, the Gulf had decent visibility at this depth, especially when weather conditions were calm like today. Instead, the water was unusually murky, filled with suspended particles that scattered my lights and reduced effective visibility to maybe 10 feet. It looked like the hurricane had stirred up bottom sediment that was still slowly settling, creating a hazy underwater environment that made navigation more challenging than usual. "Visibility is poor down here," I reported through the comm system. "Storm probably stirred up a lot of sediment from the bottom." The response came back immediately from Tom Rodriguez. "Copy that, Marcus. We're tracking your position on GPS. Your target is bearing 045 degrees from your current position, approximately 80 feet horizontal distance. Just follow your compass heading and the platform structure should come into view." I engaged my underwater propulsion unit, a small motorized device that allowed precise maneuvering in underwater environments. The unit responded smoothly, pulling me through the murky water toward the platform's support structure. As I descended past 100 feet, the water pressure increased noticeably, requiring more effort to move efficiently. The platform's massive steel legs gradually became visible through the haze, rising from the Gulf floor like the pillars of an underwater cathedral. At 150 feet, I could make out the extent of the hurricane damage. The platform's northeast support cluster showed obvious signs of stress and deformation. Metal beams that should have been perfectly straight were bent and twisted, and I could see gaps where welds had failed completely. The damage was actually worse than the photos had indicated, suggesting that the storm's forces had been even more severe than initially calculated. At 180 feet, I reached the primary work site and immediately understood why this repair job was so critical. The main support beam had a complete fracture running vertically for about 8 feet, with several smaller cracks radiating outward from the main failure point. The beam was still carrying load, but barely. If this joint failed completely, the Entire northeast corner of the platform would lose structural support, and the whole installation would collapse. The adjacent joints showed stress damage and partial separations that would need immediate attention as well. Several cross braces had pulled loose from their mounting points, leaving them hanging uselessly in the current. This was going to require at least 4 days of careful welding to properly repair, assuming I didn't encounter any unexpected complications during the work process. I began setting up my equipment methodically, following the same procedures I'd used on dozens of previous jobs. The portable welder was secured to a stable mounting point on the platform structure, with all electrical connections properly sealed against saltwater intrusion. My electrode rods were stored in a waterproof container that would keep them dry until needed. Everything had to be arranged efficiently because I'd be spending hours at this depth completing the repair work. Beginning initial assessment of damage, I reported to the surface team. Looks like we'll need full penetration welds on the main. Fracture plus reinforcement of the adjacent joints. The damage is extensive but repairable with proper technique and adequate time. I estimate 4 days minimum to complete all necessary repairs to specification. As I positioned my equipment and prepared for the first welding pass, something caught my attention in the peripheral vision of my helmet lights. A shadow had moved, just beyond the illuminated area, something too large and too deliberate to be debris floating in the current. I turned my head to get a better look, but saw nothing except the murky water and the fading outline of other platform structures in the distance. The movement had been brief but distinctive, like watching a large animal swim just beyond the range of visibility. The Gulf had plenty of marine life, including sharks and rays that could grow quite large. But something about the movement pattern seemed wrong. Marine animals moved with flowing organic motions that followed predictable patterns. What I'd glimpsed had moved with more angular, deliberate motion that didn't match normal fish behavior. I shook off the unease and focused on beginning the repair work. Deep-sea welding requires absolute concentration and attention to detail. One mistake with the equipment or technique could result in a faulty weld that might fail under stress, potentially causing catastrophic structural failure. The lives of 12 crew members depended on the quality of my work, and that responsibility weighed heavily on my mind as I prepared the first welding pass. I began with the smaller stress cracks, using a specialized underwater electrode designed to displace water and create a protective gas bubble around the weld zone. The electrode contained flux compounds that burned cleanly even in salt water, producing a strong, clean weld with minimal contamination. The familiar blue-white arc of the welder illuminated the immediate work area, creating a small sphere of brilliant light in the dark water. The welding process underwater is completely different from surface work. The water absorbs heat rapidly, requiring higher amperage settings to achieve proper penetration. The electrode consumption rate is much higher because of the constant battle against water intrusion into the weld zone, and the visual feedback is limited because the bright arc creates reflections and shadows that can mask weld quality issues. 20 minutes into the first weld, my helmet's sonar array began displaying readings that didn't make sense. The screen showed a large object moving slowly about 100 feet away, just beyond the effective range of my lights. The sonar signature indicated something approximately 30 feet in length, moving in a consistent circular pattern around the platform structure. Topside, I'm seeing something unusual on sonar, I reported while continuing to weld. Large object, maybe 30 feet long, circling the platform at about 100 feet distance. Moving pattern doesn't match expected debris or normal marine life behavior. The response took longer than usual, suggesting they were checking their own monitoring equipment. Copy that, Marcus. We're not showing anything on our surface sonar systems. Could be an equipment malfunction from the storm damage Bill mentioned. The underwater environment can create false sonar returns, especially when there's a lot of suspended sediment in the water like today. Keep monitoring and let us know if the contact gets closer or changes behavior. I continued welding but kept glancing at the sonar display between welding passes. The object maintained its circular pattern, staying at a consistent distance from the platform and depth around 200 feet. Its movement was too regular and predictable to be random debris, but too large to match any known fish species in this area. The Gulf of Mexico had sharks, grouper, and other large marine animals, but nothing that would show up as a 30-foot signature on sonar. The sonar contact was troubling, but not immediately threatening. Whatever it was seemed content to maintain distance and observe rather than approach. I tried to dismiss it as equipment malfunction, but something primitive in my brain was sending warning signals. After 8 years of deep water work, I'd learned to trust those instincts. The ocean was full of things that could kill you, and successful divers developed an almost supernatural awareness of potential threats. After completing the first section of stress crack repairs, I moved to the next damaged joint. The work was progressing well, with each weld meeting specification requirements for penetration and strength. My confidence began to return as I focused on the familiar technical challenges of underwater welding. The repairs were actually going faster than expected. At this rate, I might finish the entire project a day ahead of schedule. As I repositioned my equipment for the next welding sequence, the water around me suddenly became perfectly still. The normal current flow that had been gently moving my equipment lines stopped completely, creating an eerie sense of suspension in the dark water. The change was so abrupt and complete that it felt unnatural, like someone had suddenly turned off an underwater fan. Then I heard something that shouldn't exist at 180 feet underwater. A low, rhythmic knocking sound coming from somewhere below the platform structure. It was clearly metallic, like someone tapping a wrench against steel pipe, but with a deliberate rhythm that was definitely not random mechanical noise. The sound seemed to echo up from the deeper water beneath the platform, beyond the range of my lights. "Topside, are you running any maintenance operations on the lower platform levels?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady despite the growing unease. The knocking sound was continuing, now seeming to come from multiple directions simultaneously. It wasn't just one source, but several, all tapping out the same slow, deliberate rhythm. "Negative, Marcus. All platform activity today is confined to the main deck and dive support operations. There's no scheduled maintenance on the underwater structures except your welding work. Why? What are you hearing down there?" The dive supervisor's voice carried a note of concern that suggested this wasn't the first time someone had reported unusual sounds around platform Delta 7. "I'm hearing metallic impacts, regular pattern like someone hammering on the platform structure, multiple sources coming from below my current work position. The sounds are too regular and coordinated to be structural settling or equipment vibration." The knocking continued as I spoke, now clearly audible over the background noise of my breathing apparatus and welding equipment. There was a long pause before the response came, suggesting consultation with other crew members. "Marcus, there's no one else in the water and no mechanical operations that would create those sounds. All diving operations today are limited to your work detail. Could be metal expansion from temperature changes, or maybe debris bumping against the platform structure in the current." The knocking stopped abruptly, as if responding to the conversation, replaced by an even more disturbing silence. Not even the normal ambient sounds of the platform's underwater machinery were audible. The water around me felt dead, devoid of the subtle vibrations and background noise that usually filled underwater environments near industrial installations. I decided to continue working despite the strange acoustics. The repair schedule was tight, and I couldn't afford to lose time investigating every unusual sound or equipment reading. But I kept my underwater propulsion unit ready for quick movement and made sure my emergency ascent controls were easily accessible. Something about the environment was setting off every danger instinct I'd developed during 8 years of deep water work. The welding proceeded normally for another hour, with each joint responding well to the repair technique. The Damaged metal was good quality steel that welded cleanly with proper preparation and electrode selection. My confidence gradually returned as I focused on the familiar technical challenges of creating structurally sound underwater welds. The repairs were progressing ahead of schedule, which was good news for both the platform crew and my completion bonus. Complex underwater welding projects often encountered unexpected delays from weather, equipment problems, or access difficulties. But this job was proceeding smoothly despite the unusual environmental conditions. That's when I noticed the water temperature was dropping rapidly. My suit's heating system had been running at low power to maintain comfortable body temperature, but suddenly it ramped up to maximum output. Even with full heating, I could feel cold starting to penetrate the suit's insulation. The digital readout on my heads-up display showed the water temperature had fallen from 78 degrees to 65 degrees in less than 15 minutes. That kind of rapid temperature change shouldn't be possible at this depth, especially in the relatively stable Gulf waters during calm weather conditions. Deep water temperatures typically remained constant unless there were major current shifts or underwater geological events. A 13-degree drop in 15 minutes suggested something was causing significant water displacement in the area. Topside, I'm showing an unexpected temperature drop down here. Water temp has fallen from 78 to 65 degrees in the last 15 minutes. Suit heating is compensating, but this kind of thermal change is unusual for these conditions. You might want to check for current shifts or other environmental factors. The response was immediate this time, suggesting they were monitoring my telemetry data more closely than usual. We're seeing the same readings up here, Marcus. No explanation for the thermal change from our weather monitoring systems. Ocean temperature at depth should be stable in these conditions. How are you feeling? Any signs of cold stress or equipment problems? I'm okay for now, but if the temperature continues dropping, I'll need to surface for equipment evaluation. The suit heating is handling the current conditions, but I'm already at maximum thermal output. I continued welding, but the cold was starting to affect my manual dexterity. My hands felt stiff inside the suit's gloves, making it harder to maintain precise control of the welding electrode and equipment positioning. The temperature drop was accompanied by a change in water clarity. The murky conditions that had persisted since my descent were gradually clearing, as if whatever had been stirring up bottom sediment was settling back down. But improved visibility brought its own concerns when I realized I could now see much farther into the dark water surrounding the platform. The sonar contact returned, much closer this time. The display showed multiple objects now, ranging from 20 to 50 feet away, all moving in coordinated patterns around the platform structure. They maintained consistent depth around 200 feet, just below my current work position, and seemed to be slowly ascending. I stopped welding and focused on the sonar readings, trying to understand what could create such organized movement patterns. Schools of large fish sometimes moved in coordination, but these contacts were too large and too few to represent normal marine life. The movement was too deliberate and purposeful for debris or equipment floating in the current. Then something moved at the very edge of my vision, a dark shape that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. When I turned my helmet lights directly toward the movement, nothing was visible except clear water and the distant outline of other platform structures. But the sonar contacts continued to show objects closing distance slowly but steadily. Topside, I have definite sonar contacts approaching my position. Multiple objects, 20 to 50 feet in length, coordinated movement pattern. Visual contact is intermittent, but something large is definitely in the area. Recommend immediate safety assessment and possible abort of dive operations. I reached for my ascent controls, planning to surface immediately for consultation with the dive team. But when I tried to activate the emergency ascent system, I discovered that my communication line was completely dead. The normal background hiss of the radio was gone, replaced by absolute silence. The backup communication system showed no signal, and even the emergency locator beacon wasn't responding to activation commands. Panic began to set in as the full implications became clear. I was completely cut off from the surface team, 180 feet underwater, with unknown contacts approaching my position. My training immediately kicked in with emergency procedures for total communication failure. In case of equipment breakdown, protocol was to begin immediate emergency ascent and rely on surface safety divers to monitor my progress. But as I started to ascend, something grabbed my ankle with crushing force. The grip felt like a steel clamp closing around my diving boot, strong, enough to stop my ascent completely despite the buoyancy of my suit and equipment. I looked down to see what had caught me, expecting to find my equipment line tangled in the platform structure, or maybe a piece of debris that had gotten wrapped around my leg. Instead, I saw a hand. A human hand, but wrong in every possible way. It was pale white, like something that had been underwater for years, and much larger than any normal person's hand. The fingers were too long for the palm, extending well beyond normal human proportions, and they were wrapped around my ankle with impossible strength. The skin looked waterlogged and corpse-like, but the grip was very much alive. I could feel the fingers adjusting their hold, tightening when I tried to pull away. The arm extended back into the darkness beyond my lights, disappearing into water that should have been empty except for platform support structures. I tried to kick free with my other leg, but more hands emerged from the darkness below. They reached up from the depths beneath the platform, grasping at my equipment lines, my diving suit, and any part of my body they could reach. I could see arms extending upward from what should have been empty water, all with that same pale, waterlogged appearance. The hands moved with deliberate purpose and coordination, not the random grasping of drowning victims or the mechanical movement of machinery. These were intelligent, purposeful actions by something that understood exactly what it was trying to accomplish. They wanted to drag me down into the depths beneath the platform, toward whatever waited in the darkness below. Terror completely overrode my professional training as I fought against the grasping hands. I grabbed my welding torch and used it as a weapon, triggering the electric arc and making contact with the nearest arm. There was a sound like steam escaping under pressure, and the smell of burned flesh filled my helmet. The arm recoiled immediately, but 3 others took its place. More hands than I could count were reaching up from the darkness now, all trying to establish holds on my equipment and body. They seemed to be emerging from the platform structure itself, as if something was living within the steel framework that supported the installation. The coordination was perfect, with each hand working together toward the goal of dragging me down. I managed to break free by cutting through several of my own equipment lines with the welding torch, sacrificing hundreds of dollars worth of specialized gear to escape the grasping hands. The electric arc seemed to be the only thing they couldn't tolerate, causing immediate recoil whenever I made contact with the burning electrode. My emergency ascent was much faster than recommended safety protocols, but I didn't care about decompression, sickness when something inhuman was trying to drag me into the abyss. As I rose rapidly through the water, I could see pale shapes moving in the darkness below, following my ascent, but staying just beyond the range of my lights. The shapes moved with fluid coordination, like parts of a larger organism working together toward a common goal. They maintained formation as they followed me upward, but seemed reluctant to enter the brighter water closer to the surface. Whatever they were, they preferred the deep darkness beneath the platform, where their pale forms would be nearly invisible. At 100 feet depth, the shapes suddenly stopped following and descended back toward the platform structure. It was as if they had territorial boundaries that they wouldn't cross, preferring to remain in the deep water where they held the advantage. I continued my rapid ascent, breaking safety protocols but desperate to reach the surface and human assistance. Broke through to surface waters, gasping and yelling for immediate extraction. The platform crew had been monitoring my ascent on their tracking systems and had the hydraulic crane ready to pull me out of the water. As they lifted me onto the platform deck, I was shaking uncontrollably and could barely form coherent words to describe what had happened. Bill Harrison was waiting with several crew members as they helped me out of my diving suit. My hands were shaking so badly that I couldn't manage the suit's fasteners, requiring assistance to remove the equipment. As I tried to explain what had happened underwater, my words came out as disjointed fragments that probably sounded like the ravings of someone suffering from nitrogen narcosis. "Slow down, Marcus," Bill said, once I'd been helped to a chair and given hot coffee to combat the shock. "Start from the beginning and tell us exactly what you experienced down there." His tone was calm and professional, but I could see genuine concern in his eyes as he listened to my account. I described everything in detail: the temperature drop, the coordinated sonar contacts, the complete communication failure, and finally the encounter with the pale hands that had tried to drag me deeper underwater. As I spoke, I watched the faces of the platform crew. None of them looked surprised by my account. Instead, they wore expressions of resignation and grim understanding. "We should have warned you properly," Bill finally said once I had finished my story. "Platform Delta 7 has had incidents since it was first built in 1983. Workers going missing during routine underwater maintenance, equipment malfunctions that can't be explained or reproduced, communication failures during dive operations. The company keeps everything quiet because shutting down the platform would cost millions in lost production." He gestured toward the dark water surrounding the platform, now looking much more ominous than it had during my arrival yesterday. "This platform was built over what used to be productive fishing grounds. Commercial boats worked this area regularly until the early 1960s, when they started reporting problems. Nets coming up empty from areas that should have been full of fish, equipment failures that couldn't be explained, and boats that went missing without sending distress calls. Local fishermen stopped working these coordinates completely by 1965, claiming the area was cursed or haunted. When the oil companies started exploring here in the late 1970s, they found rich petroleum deposits, but also encountered the same problems that had driven away the fishing fleet. The first platform built here was abandoned after 3 construction workers disappeared during foundation installation, but the oil reserves were too valuable to abandon completely, so they redesigned the platform with enhanced safety systems and brought in a crew willing to work, despite the location's reputation. For 40 years, Platform Delta 7 has operated successfully, but always with the understanding that underwater work carries unusual risks that go beyond normal industrial hazards. I demanded immediate evacuation from the platform, but Bill explained that weather conditions had deteriorated and helicopter transport wouldn't be possible until the following morning. A storm front was moving through the area, bringing high winds and reduced visibility that made flight operations too dangerous to attempt. I spent that night in one of the platform's crew quarters, a small room with a narrow bunk and basic amenities. Sleep was impossible despite my exhaustion from the day's traumatic experience. Every metallic sound from the platform's normal operations made me think of the rhythmic knocking I had heard underwater. Every vibration from wave action against the support legs reminded me of those pale hands reaching up from the depths. The crew quarters had a small porthole that looked out over the Gulf waters. I found myself staring into the darkness, wondering what was moving beneath the surface. The platform's underwater lights created pools of illumination around the support legs. But beyond that was absolute blackness that could hide anything. Around midnight, I thought I saw movement in the water near the platform's northeast support cluster, exactly where I had been working earlier. Pale shapes seemed to glide just below the surface, visible for brief moments before disappearing back into the depths. I convinced myself it was just my imagination, trauma-induced hallucinations from the day's encounter. But the next morning, Bill approached me with troubling news. The overnight watch had reported unusual sonar contacts around the platform throughout the night. Objects moving in coordinated patterns around the underwater structure, always staying just beyond the range of the platform's external cameras. The contacts had disappeared at dawn, but their presence had been consistent for over 6 hours. The company is prepared to offer you a substantial completion bonus to finish the repair work, Bill said with obvious reluctance. Triple your normal rate, plus a $25,000 completion bonus if you can finish the structural repairs within the next 48 hours. The platform's insurance situation is complicated, and they need documentation that proper repairs were attempted by certified personnel. The money was incredibly tempting, more than I would make in 6 months of normal work. But when I looked out at the dark water surrounding Platform Delta 7, I knew no amount of money was worth going back down there. Whatever was living in the depths beneath the platform had made it clear that human presence wasn't welcome. I'm sorry, but I can't do it, I told Bill honestly. Whatever's down there, it's not something I can work around or defend against. You need to bring in a full dive team with military-grade equipment and proper security protocols. This isn't a job for a single contractor. Bill nodded with the weary resignation of someone who had heard similar responses before. We've tried bringing in full teams. Most commercial diving companies won't work this platform anymore once word gets around about the conditions. The few that will accept contracts usually abort operations after the first encounter. You lasted longer than most. He pulled out a thick folder filled with incident reports and contractor evaluations dating back 15 years. Every major diving company in the Gulf has attempted work here at some point. Subsea Solutions lasted 2 days before pulling their entire crew. Deep Current Industries made it through 1 dive before declaring the site unsafe. Global Marine Services tried 3 times with different teams before permanently blacklisting Platform Delta 7. The pattern was always the same, Bill explained. Equipment malfunctions during the first day, usually communication systems and navigation gear. Strange sonar contacts during the second day, always coordinated movement patterns that didn't match known marine life. Physical encounters by the 3rd day, always resulting in immediate evacuation and contract termination. What makes it worse is that we can't even get honest incident reports from most contractors. They're afraid word will spread and damage their reputations in the industry. So they file generic reports citing equipment failures or weather delays, never mentioning the real reasons for contract termination. The official record makes it look like Platform Delta 7 just has bad luck with contractors. But you've been operating here for 40 years, I pointed out. How do you maintain the platform if no one can work underwater? Bill's expression darkened as he considered his response, clearly debating how much truth to share with someone who was about to leave and never return. We do minimal underwater maintenance, he finally admitted. Only the most critical repairs that absolutely can't be delayed. And we've learned to work around the conditions through trial and error. Short duration dives, never more than 30 minutes at depth. Multiple divers working in rotation so no one stays down long enough for extended contact. And we schedule all underwater work during daylight hours when activity seems to be reduced. He showed me modified diving protocols that read like military. Special operations procedures rather than standard industrial safety guidelines. Divers worked in teams of 3 with armed surface support. All equipment included redundant communication systems and emergency ascent capabilities. Dive duration was limited to 20 minutes maximum, regardless of work completion status. Most importantly, they had learned to recognize warning signs that preceded encounters. Rapid temperature drops, coordinated sonar contacts, and communication. Interference were immediate abort conditions. Any diver who reported these phenomena was extracted immediately without question or delay. The protocol prioritized crew safety over project completion in every situation. These procedures have allowed us to maintain basic platform operations, but we can't handle major structural repairs like what you were hired to complete. The hurricane. Damage is beyond our capability to fix with short-duration maintenance dives. We need someone willing to stay down long enough to complete complex welding operations, and apparently that's not possible anymore. I spent the morning waiting for helicopter transport and talking with crew members about their experiences on Platform Delta 7. The stories were remarkably consistent, despite coming from people who had worked different shifts over many years. Everyone had experienced equipment malfunctions during underwater operations. Everyone had seen unexplained sonar contacts that disappeared when investigated. And several had witnessed or heard accounts of physical encounters with things that shouldn't exist. Jake Morrison, the platform's maintenance supervisor, had been working Delta 7 for 12 years. He described multiple incidents where routine inspections had been aborted due to equipment failures that couldn't be reproduced during surface testing. Communication systems would fail at depth, but work perfectly when brought topside. Navigation. Equipment would provide false readings underwater, but function normally in air. The most disturbing pattern was the progressive escalation of incidents over time. Early problems were limited to equipment malfunctions and brief sonar contacts. But as the years passed, encounters became more direct and aggressive. Divers reported being followed by large shapes that maintained consistent distance. Equipment lines were found tangled or damaged in ways that couldn't be explained by current action or debris. 3 years ago, Jake had personally witnessed an incident that convinced him never to dive on Platform Delta 7 again. He was serving as backup diver for a routine hull inspection when the primary diver's communication line went dead at 150 feet depth. Following emergency protocols, Jake descended immediately to provide assistance and discovered the diver unconscious and entangled in what appeared to be organic material. The diver survived, but had no memory of what happened during the 20 minutes of communication blackout. Medical examination revealed bruising around his arms and legs, consistent with being grabbed by something with incredible strength. The organic material that had entangled him was never identified, but laboratory analysis suggested it was biological in origin and unlike any known marine life in the Gulf. Since that incident, Platform Delta 7 had implemented the shortened dive protocols and multi-diver safety procedures. The new rules had prevented similar encounters, but also made it impossible to complete major maintenance projects that required extended underwater work. The platform was slowly deteriorating from deferred maintenance that couldn't be safely performed. Tom Rodriguez, the dive supervisor, shared his theory about what was happening beneath Platform Delta 7. He believed the platform had been built over some kind of underwater cave system or geological formation that housed something that didn't want human intrusion. The coordinated behavior and apparent intelligence suggested organization beyond simple animal instincts. Local fishing crews from the 1960s had reported similar phenomena before the area was abandoned to commercial fishing. Nets would come up, torn and empty from areas that sonar showed were full of fish. Equipment would malfunction specifically in this location while working perfectly everywhere else. Boats would experience navigation problems that caused them to lose position and drift away from productive fishing grounds. The fishermen had eventually developed their own folklore about the area, claiming it was haunted by the spirits of sailors who had drowned in storms or been lost overboard. But Tom believed the explanation was more mundane, if no less dangerous. Something lived in the deep water beneath what would eventually become Platform Delta 7. Something that had territorial instincts and the intelligence to defend its habitat systematically. The helicopter arrived just after noon, providing my escape from Platform Delta 7 and its underwater mysteries. As we lifted off from the platform's landing pad, I looked down at the installation that had nearly cost me my life. From the air, it looked like any other offshore drilling platform, a routine industrial installation surrounded by empty ocean. But I knew what lurked beneath those innocuous-looking waters. Something that had been defending its territory for decades, driving away anyone who tried to work in its domain. The hurricane damage that had brought me to Platform Delta 7 would remain unrepaired, adding to the platform's gradual deterioration and eventual abandonment. During the flight back to Port Fourchon, I made a decision that would change how I approached deep-sea welding contracts for the rest of my career. I would research every job site thoroughly before accepting work, looking for patterns of contractor turnover, equipment failures, and unexplained incidents. The deep-sea welding community was small and tight-knit, but information about problem locations was often suppressed by companies trying to protect their investments. I spent the following weeks reaching out to other commercial divers, sharing my experience at Platform Delta 7 and asking about similar encounters at other locations. The response was overwhelming and disturbing. Nearly every experienced deep-sea welder had at least one story about a job site where things went wrong in ways that couldn't be explained by normal industrial hazards. There were platforms in the North Sea where divers reported being followed by things that stayed just beyond the range of their lights. Pipeline projects in the Gulf where entire crews had been pulled from job sites after reporting coordinated attacks by unknown marine life. Bridge foundation work in major harbors where equipment failures occurred in patterns that suggested deliberate interference. The common thread was corporate pressure to suppress these incidents and complete projects regardless of crew safety concerns. Companies had millions of dollars invested in offshore installations and couldn't afford to abandon projects based on what management considered superstitious fears or equipment malfunctions. Divers who reported unusual encounters were often accused of substance abuse, psychological problems, or attempting to defraud insurance companies. This systematic suppression meant that dangerous job sites continued to operate, with contractors cycling through diving teams until someone was willing to work despite the hazards. Platform Delta 7 was just one example of an installation that should have been abandoned years ago, but continued operating because the financial stakes were too high to admit defeat. I began documenting everything I could discover about problematic job sites, creating an unofficial database that I shared with other commercial divers through industry forums and professional contacts. The goal was to provide advance warning about locations where standard safety procedures might not be adequate protection against non-standard threats. Within 6 months, I heard through industry contacts that Platform Delta 7 had been evacuated and was being prepared for decommissioning. The official explanation cited escalating maintenance costs and declining petroleum reserves that made continued operation economically unfeasible. But I knew the real reason was that they could no longer find contractors willing to perform the underwater maintenance necessary to keep the platform operational. The decommissioning process itself proved problematic, according to sources familiar with the project. The specialized underwater cutting and demolition work required to safely remove platform structures encountered the same problems that had plagued maintenance operations. Equipment failures, communication problems, and direct encounters with unknown entities forced multiple delays and contractor changes. Eventually, the decommissioning company opted for a partial removal that left most of the underwater structure in place. The platform's upper levels were dismantled and removed, but the foundation supports and lower framework were abandoned on the Gulf floor. The official justification was environmental protection, claiming that removing the underwater structures would cause more ecological damage than leaving them in place. But industry insiders understood the real reason. It was simply impossible to complete underwater work at that location for extended periods. Whatever inhabited the depths beneath Platform Delta 7 had successfully defended its territory against human intrusion for over 40 years, and would continue to do so long after the oil company had written off their investment and moved on to more manageable locations. 3 months after my encounter, I still wake up in cold sweats thinking about those pale hands reaching up from the darkness. The memory is so vivid that I can still feel the crushing grip around my ankle and see those 2 long fingers wrapped around my diving boot. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined the whole thing, if nitrogen narcosis or decompression stress created hallucinations that seem terrifyingly real. But then I remember the incident reports, the consistent stories from other crew members, and the long history of problems at Platform Delta 7. Too many people have reported similar encounters for this to be coincidence or shared delusion. Something inhabits the deep waters around that platform, something that has intelligence and territorial instincts and the ability to coordinate attacks against human intruders. I've tried researching the geological and historical background of the area, hoping to understand what might be living beneath Platform Delta 7. The Gulf of Mexico has complex underwater topography with deep trenches, underwater caverns, and geological formations that could provide habitat for unknown species. The area where the platform was built sits at the edge of a steep underwater canyon that drops to depths of over 1,000 feet. Historical records from the 1800s mention unusual incidents in this general area of the Gulf. Ships reported equipment failures and navigation problems when crossing certain coordinates. Fishing boats found their nets torn by something that left distinctive claw marks in the mesh. Several vessels disappeared without distress calls in calm weather conditions that should have allowed safe passage. The indigenous peoples who lived along the Gulf Coast before European colonization had oral traditions about spirits that lived in the deep water and would drag down anyone who disturbed their domain. These stories were dismissed by later settlers as primitive superstition, but they show remarkable consistency with modern reports of encounters at Platform Delta 7. Marine biologists have documented several species of deep-water cephalopods in the Gulf that can grow to enormous sizes and demonstrate problem-solving intelligence that rivals some mammals. Giant squid and colossal squid are known to inhabit deep ocean environments, though they're rarely encountered at depths as shallow as 200 feet. But these known species don't display the coordinated group behavior that characterized my encounter. The truth is that we know remarkably little about what lives in the deep ocean, especially in specific locations like underwater canyons and cave systems. New species are discovered regularly, often with capabilities and behaviors that surprise marine researchers. It's entirely possible that Platform Delta 7 was built over habitat for something that science hasn't yet catalogued or studied. What troubles me most is the realization that I might not have been the first person to encounter whatever lives beneath Platform Delta 7. The platform had been operating for 40 years, with a consistent pattern of underwater incidents and contractor turnover. How many other workers had been grabbed by those pale hands over the decades? How many had been dragged down into the depths and never surfaced? The official safety records for offshore platforms are maintained by federal agencies and should document every serious incident or worker fatality. But I've learned that companies have considerable flexibility in how they classify and report incidents, especially when the circumstances are unusual or difficult to explain. Equipment failures and human error are acceptable explanations that don't invite further investigation. A diver who disappears during routine maintenance could be listed as a drowning due to equipment malfunction. Someone who's found unconscious and entangled could be classified as suffering from nitrogen narcosis that caused disorientation and accident. Medical emergencies related to decompression sickness or oxygen toxicity provide convenient explanations for almost any underwater incident. The families of missing workers would be told their loved ones were lost to routine industrial accidents, the kind of occupational hazard that comes with dangerous deep water work. They would receive life insurance payouts and workers' compensation benefits, but never learn the truth about what happened to their husbands, fathers, and sons in the dark water beneath Platform Delta 7. This systematic cover-up means that the true extent of the problem may never be known. How many commercial divers have been killed or injured by encounters with unknown entities in the Gulf of Mexico? How many offshore installations are operating over habitat for things that view human presence as territorial intrusion to be repelled by any means necessary? The deep-sea welding industry operates under a culture of stoic professionalism where admitting fear or reporting unusual incidents can damage career prospects. Divers are expected to work in dangerous conditions without complaint, handling whatever challenges arise through skill and experience. Someone who claims to have encountered sea monsters or underwater entities is likely to be labeled as unreliable and have difficulty finding future employment. This pressure to remain silent means that critical safety information isn't shared among workers who might benefit from advance warning about problematic job sites. Each diver encounters dangerous locations without knowing about previous incidents, learning about threats only through direct personal experience that might prove fatal. I've made a personal commitment to break this pattern of silence by sharing my experience openly and encouraging other commercial divers to report unusual encounters regardless of professional consequences. The deep-sea welding community needs accurate information about job site hazards, including threats that don't appear in standard safety manuals or equipment training programs. Since returning from Platform Delta 7, I've changed my approach to evaluating potential contracts. I research every job site thoroughly, looking for patterns of contractor turnover, equipment failures, and reported incidents that might indicate non-standard hazards. I've turned down several high-paying contracts because my research revealed histories of problems that suggested risks beyond normal industrial dangers. This careful screening has cost me significant income, but it's also probably saved my life on multiple occasions. Other divers have contacted me after accepting contracts at locations I had declined, reporting encounters and incidents that confirmed my decision to avoid those job sites. The informal network of information sharing among experienced divers has prevented several potential tragedies. I still work as a commercial deep-sea welder, but now I specialize in jobs at well-documented locations with established safety records. I've given up chasing the highest-paying emergency contracts that often come with unknown risks and inadequate safety preparation. My income is lower, but I sleep better knowing that I'm unlikely to encounter anything beneath the surface except normal marine life and industrial hazards. The ocean is dangerous enough without adding supernatural threats to the list of things that can kill you during underwater operations. Standard safety protocols are designed to handle equipment failures, medical emergencies, and environmental hazards, like strong currents or poor visibility. They're not adequate protection against intelligent entities that can coordinate attacks and adapt their tactics based on human defensive measures. If you're involved in any kind of deep water work, diving, welding, underwater construction, or marine salvage, please be extremely careful about the contracts you accept. Research job sites thoroughly, looking for patterns of incidents that might indicate unusual hazards. Trust your instincts if something feels wrong about a location or work assignment. And never dive alone in areas where other contractors have reported problems. The commercial diving industry needs to develop new safety protocols that acknowledge the possibility of encounters with unknown marine life or entities that demonstrate intelligence and territorial behavior. Current procedures assume that underwater threats are limited to known hazards, like marine animals, equipment failures, and environmental conditions. We need better communication systems that can't be disrupted by unknown interference. We need emergency ascent procedures that can overcome physical restraint by entities with superhuman strength. And we need honest reporting of unusual incidents so that other divers can make informed decisions about accepting contracts at problematic locations. Most importantly, we need corporate accountability for companies that suppress incident reports or pressure divers to work in locations with documented safety problems. The financial stakes involved in offshore operations create enormous pressure to complete projects regardless of crew safety, but no amount of money justifies exposing workers to threats that could kill them. Platform Delta 7 was finally abandoned after 40 years of operation, but only after countless encounters and incidents that were covered up or explained away as routine industrial accidents. How many other installations are currently operating under similar conditions, cycling through contractors who don't know about the true risks they're facing? The Gulf of Mexico contains hundreds of offshore platforms and thousands of miles of underwater pipeline that require regular maintenance and repair. If even a small percentage of these installations were built over habitat for territorial entities like what I encountered, the scope of the problem could be enormous. We might be unknowingly conducting an underwater war against species that view our industrial activities as invasion and occupation of their domain. The solution isn't to abandon offshore oil production or underwater construction projects. These industries provide essential energy resources and economic benefits that society needs. But we need to approach deep water work with better understanding of potential hazards and improved safety procedures that can handle encounters with unknown entities. I never found out exactly what happened to Platform Delta 7 after it was decommissioned. Some sources claim the underwater structures were completely removed and the site was restored to its original condition. Others say the foundation supports were left in place and the area was designated as an artificial reef for marine habitat protection. Either way, I sleep better knowing that no other workers will have to descend into those depths and face whatever waits in the darkness below. The Gulf of Mexico is vast enough to accommodate both human industrial activity and whatever unknown species inhabit its deepest waters, as long as we're smart enough to avoid building in areas where our presence isn't welcome. The official records will show that Platform Delta 7 was closed due to structural damage from Hurricane Melissa and declining petroleum reserves that made continued operation economically unfeasible. But I know the truth, that some things in the deep ocean are better left undisturbed, and that the Gulf of Mexico holds secrets that are darker and more dangerous than any storm. If my story helps even one person avoid a similar encounter, then sharing these memories will have been worthwhile. The ocean keeps its secrets well, but sometimes those secrets fight back when we venture too deep into places where humans were never meant to go.